Greetings. My name is Chris Webb, and I'm an anthropologist and a professor of anthropology at Fort Lewis College in Colorado. And I'm going to talk to you about the usage of Native American ritual in the treatment of moral injury and my own encounters with this, both as a researcher and as a person who has experienced healing in this kind of space. And when I say that, I want to be clear that my encounter that I'm going to be talking about is one of the most significant and impactful events of my life. So the way that I'm going to organize this lecture is to break it into parts. And I'm going to share this with you. Okay. So there are going to be basically four parts to this. The first part is going to be a very brief introduction to the concept of anthropological analysis. I am an anthropologist, and my work is informed by this. So I think that a little bit of perspective into how I'm approaching this will be helpful. And this also transitions well with the next part, which is about the concept of ritual itself. And you'll see what I mean in a minute when I say I'm interested in what it means that we're even having this conversation in the first place, asking what it is to use ritual to heal moral injury. And next, I'm going to go into my own story, encountering the rituals, what it's like. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about the significance of all this, the significance of this sort of ritual. So at the beginning, I am, like I said, I'm an anthropologist, and I'm also a war veteran with physical combat wounds and a PTSD diagnosis. This means that my pursuit of healing in the ceremonies that I participated in, because I participated in Indigenous healing ceremonies, included anthropological analysis. But to say a little bit more about this, I'm also what you would call a medical anthropologist. So to be clear about what this means, anthropology is the holistic study of humans, very broadly defined, and there are lots of subfields. Cultural anthropology, I am a cultural anthropologist. Cultural anthropology studies human culture and understands human culture as being very, very diverse and also very socially constructed. The practices and behaviors, the cultural things that we see among different people around the world, we recognize as being things that people learn to do. And within cultural anthropology, we have medical anthropology. And like I said, I'm a medical anthropologist. And that means that this cultural anthropology approach is applied to the study of medicine, to suffering, and to cultures of healing in general. So medical anthropology studies medicine and healing cross-culturally. And we study Western biomedical forms of healing, but we also study cultural forms of healing that come from around the world. Lots of peoples in the world use other ways of understanding suffering and healing, and we look at that in medical anthropology. This can include understanding affliction in terms of things like witchcraft or hauntings, or the relationships that someone has with their ancestors. Contemporary medical anthropology often investigates the impact of medicalization on culture. To try to explain what that means, I'm going to distinguish here that the way that I'm approaching this subject is really different than what a lot of people expect when they start to hear what I work on. I'm not going to be going into like really extreme specific detail about a particular ritual and how it does this and that. I attended a conference a few years ago in Los Angeles where a number of people were describing the efficacy of experiences they were having in treating moral injury, a lot of things that we would call ritual. And in response to this, a very prominent clinician and historical scholar of PTSD and moral injury who was there was compelled by what they saw, and they suggested thinking about the clinical approach to the diagnosis and prescription of, for example, drumming for moral injury and trauma healing. And this is not what I'm going to do. This is not the method that an anthropologist uses. So I want to give a couple of definitions here. One of these is ethnomedicine. Ethnomedicine is a society's cultural knowledge of the management of health and treatments for illness, sickness, and disease. And there's biomedicine. Biomedicine is an ethnomedical system that was deeply shaped by European and is deeply shaped by European and North American history and is rooted in the cultural system of Western science. This is important. A lot of people think of ethnomedicine as being something different than biomedicine, but it's not. Um, the thing that we need to understand when we talk about biomedicine is that biomedicine is an ethnomedical system. It is a form of ethnomedicine. It is the way that a society of people, like many societies of people in the world, have cultural knowledge about managing health and illness and treatment and things like that. But in Western society, when we're talking about biomedicine, we're talking about a form of healing, a form of understanding pain and suffering that is deeply, deeply inflected by, rooted in the cultural system of Western science. So in anthropology, I think I mentioned already that with medical anthropology, a lot of times the things that we study end up being discussions about relating to the process of medicalization and the impact that medicalization has had on the world. So we have this definition here. Medicalization is the ongoing historical process of transforming phenomena that were previously thought of as being social phenomena into medical phenomena. For example, something that a lot of people understand is we can look at a phenomena like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, over the past few decades has become recognized as a disease. It's treated as a medical thing. It's something that's understood as a biological experience and something that's treated with medical interventions like pharmaceuticals and therapy. That's not the way it used to be thought of. It used to be thought of as something personal or something social. But through time, things have increasingly been thought of as being medical things. And, there might be good and bad with that, but it's a thing that's happened. But when we talk about moral injury, this is a very important thing to understand because medicalized institutions and norms deeply struggle to understand and treat forms of suffering, things like moral injury that do not easily conform to the medicalized schemas that we're used to using. So I'm going to back away from that for a minute and move to our next part, which is the concept of ritual itself. What is ritual? A very common definition is that ritual is a religious service or other ceremony that involves a series of actions that are performed in a fixed order. Okay. I just want to take a minute to say that it's an interesting subject to consider the efficacy of ritual in treating trauma. One of the reasons for this is that the administration and experience of biomedicine is a ritual. When you go to the doctor when you're sick, there's a ritual associated with that. And in some ways, talking about ritual as something different from biomedicine kind of goes along with this split that we imagine to exist that I talked about earlier between ethnomedicine and biomedicine. So it's surprising to a lot of people in our society when we say that something like ritual can be healing for people, that it can be efficacious. But saying that means that we are recognizing that methods and techniques that are not contingent upon biomedicine and its norms can be healing. And that's kind of what we mean. In other words, within a society of science, like the one that we're in, we have a tendency to assign mystical or magical sounding terminology to anything that appears to be outside of those boundaries. And the reason that I'm saying this is because many of the world's peoples who are designers of practices that we call rituals, they don't necessarily consider those practices to be something different from science. But in the society that I live in, this is something we have a tendency to do. And all this matters when we start talking about my own story and the rituals, the way that the rituals that I experienced and that I'm talking about today are constructed. Um, so moving to this next part, talking about my story, I mentioned earlier that I'm a war veteran. I was wounded in combat in Afghanistan. I used to be in the infantry. And when I got home, I was having a really hard time. Times weren't good. This is a common experience that a lot of people have. Um, and I was diagnosed with PTSD. Um, and I'm putting post-traumatic stress disorder in very big letters right here for a reason. Um, After this diagnosis, I went through, the typical evidence-based treatment, processes that people tend to go through, and I made a couple of observations. One of these observations was that absolutely every single thing that was going wrong in my life in this time period was being understood and explained to me by clinicians, by people in my community, in the context of PTSD. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was the explicit lens that was given to me and used by everyone around me to make sense out of the struggles that I was having. The second observation that I made was that while the PTSD diagnosis and therapies that I went through did do me some good, there were some improvements that I experienced there. They didn't fix everything. There are a lot of regions of my life and my mind and my spirit that weren't being accessed by PTSD therapy. So from there, my logical hypothesis was that I was experiencing a lot of suffering that was not PTSD. But that for some reason, PTSD seemed to be the only lens that my society was able or willing to use to manage the experiences that I was having. Like I've said before, very often in the practice of medical anthropology, what we find is that a lot of the inadequacies that exist in our society's treatment of health and healing are due to limitations that are imposed by biomedical ways of thinking. Does this apply to the PTSD diagnosis as well? Hypothesize that it does, and that was my starting point. So when we look at what this has to do with the place where I did my research fieldwork and experience healing rituals, we have to go back to when PTSD was recognized. PTSD was recognized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980, and VA medical centers began to work to address the very public and conspicuous suffering, primarily of Vietnam War veterans, but subsequently other people too. This included the establishment of a unique PTSD inpatient clinic in Washington State, where a lot of the early research on PTSD with regard to responses to forms of therapy was conducted. The uniqueness of this clinic resulted in a lot of what were considered to be very severe cases of PTSD in the Western United States being sent to this hospital. This included a lot of Native American veterans. Native Americans serve in the military at the highest rate of any ethnic group in the United States. And a lot of these people who were deemed severe cases of PTSD were sent to this inpatient clinic. And what happened was that there appeared to be a poorer healing rate of Native American veterans compared to other people who were going through these therapies. And this became a very severe situation, to the point that a lot of the clinicians working in this hospital, a lot of the volunteers and other medical staff started saying they didn't want to work with Native Americans anymore. They were afraid of them. They felt like what they were doing wasn't working. And it started turning into a situation. And people were asking, why isn't PTSD therapy, why isn't it working for everyone anyway? but it seems to be working even more poorly for Native American veterans who have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. So what happened, to make a long story short, was consultation between tribal leaders and the VA, Veterans Administration. They determined that it would be appropriate to offer indigenous purification and healing rituals provided by Native American spiritual leaders in the community as a form of healing for indigenous veterans. There was a long process through which this became the case. It was controversial at first, due to some questions about equity, but it ended up happening. And through time, the sweat lodge ceremony became central to what was being done there at this site. And it's to this day the center of American Indian programming at that hospital. And the way that it happens today is that there are ceremonies most weeks, either a sweat lodge ceremony or other forms of ceremonies too, like talking circles. And these historically were mostly exclusive to Native American veterans, not because other veterans were excluded from the ceremonies, but because until the 21st century, it wasn't something that really occurred to people that anyone else would want to do. But nowadays, that it's more and more common for more diverse people to attend these ceremonies and to find healing in them. So in my first sweat lodge ceremony that I experienced there, I was granted access to that space through my own PTSD diagnosis. I was told when I reached out to them that any veteran with a PTSD diagnosis was allowed to come and participate in this. So I showed up. I started doing my research and looking, and I noticed that on the website for the community there, they had an overt connection to different forms of symptoms for PTSD and how the sweat lodge can heal those things. I'm showing some of them here, like a criteria: depression, search for meaning, identity diffusion, and then change in symptom cluster via purification ritual, reformation of the self, positive mood, enhanced sense of centering and identity. And this goes on and on. I have just a few of these here, but this is just one little grouping of all of the things that were shown on the site there. I'm going to stop the screen share for a minute. What I recognize here is that at the healing community there, it's structurally necessary to connect the work that they're doing to clinical PTSD therapy. And they do this through describing how life improvements that are experienced by people who heal there correlate with the relief of documented PTSD symptoms in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. But when you're there, the way that the notion of trauma is understood and treated can be really different. At this first site, when I showed up, a regular participant told me, he said, PTSD isn't exactly what we're working on here. And in that ceremony, as has been the case with the majority of the ceremonies that I've done there, at the very beginning, the elders gather all the newcomers and give teachings. And the elder who was conducting the ceremonies that day got us all together, all the new people, and he started to give a teaching. And he said, the ceremony that we're doing is one that comes from the Lakota people. It's something that's available to us through some historical processes that happen. It's very helpful for people who lost our language and culture through colonization. And for this ceremony, what we are going to be addressing, what we are going to be healing, is going to be what's called Iwa Yazan Azuyeya in the Lakota language. And I will, I'm going to show you this too. So Here we go. Iwayazan Azuyeya. This is the object of the ceremonies there. Iwayazan Azuyeya means the sickness that one acquires from being in battle with others and the self, or sometimes I hear people just say the sickness of fighting. This teaching continued, and he said, a lot of what's called PTSD today is actually Iwayazan Azuyeya. You have a mind and a body and a soul, and what we're doing here is soul work. This is work on the soul. And this term, Iwayazan Azuyeya, has been referenced in every sweat lodge ceremony. I participated there. And at the time, that first ceremonial experience that I had, I did not recognize the importance of the distinction between Iwayazan Azuyeya and moral injury. But this became something that was very clear to me later, and this is central to what we need to understand about the conduct of the ceremonies there. I'm going to quote the ceremonial elder. I asked him some things about the ceremony, and this is from Mike. Mike is from the Blackfeet Nation and has been the ceremonial elder there at this site for a very, very long time. He said, many years ago, I was asked often, how do we deal with PTSD helping veterans? Realizing that PTSD is a diagnosis of symptoms, I felt time needed to be spent on an explanation of what the difference between diagnosis of symptoms and sickness as a result of diagnosis. When I would go into lodge, I focused on what was the most important or the most common sickness we faced as a people, the sickness of being in battle with people in the self. In the language of the Lakota people, this would be Iwayazan Azuyeya. This is a sickness of the world's people. As Native people and as people of the world, we have been caught up in following without question of why, instinctively knowing that something is wrong. He also said we need to look at the root of our sickness, and PTSD is not the root. Going on, he said, by attending Inipi ceremonies, that's the sweat lodge, or healing places, it allows us a place to return, share events, pain, experiences, whether spoken or not, without explanation. It's understood. We're able to refocus, release toxins, share time with those who have similar experiences. It's Iwayazan Azuyeya. War has drawn us into and away from our center place. And it's a way, but it is not the way. And until that changes, we need to cleanse our spirit, understanding that we are spirits having a human experience. And it is unnatural for the spirit to be in battle with other spirits. And we know it and we feel it. Okay, this is important because the clinical approach to PTSD is treating a condition that's understood as a biological experience. And in some ways, we may say a natural experience. And our approach here, when we're looking at Iwayazan Azuyeya, what the ceremonial elder Mike was telling us is that we are addressing a reaction to an unnatural experience. This concept of fighting is broadly defined. It makes a lot of sense to people in a very direct way if we're talking about war, which is an experience that a lot of people at these ceremonies have had because it's been taking veterans. But it's a lot bigger than that too, and is understood as a kind of unnatural conflict and an unbalance that has come into humans. And I want to talk about the significance of this. Iwayazan Azuyeya is the object of the rituals. And this is in contrast to PTSD. Like I said, that's an understanding of something almost like a physical wound. But our understanding here in these ceremonies is that the act of conflict, which can be conflict with the self, addiction, abuse, a lot of different kinds of violence, creates an imbalance in the soul. And this is something that can be experienced inside of the self. And in this place, because of the context there is a very direct and overt connection to the experience of colonization. So a tendency in medicalization is to fragment and to create new diagnoses and subdiagnoses to make things more and more clinical, more and more definitions of things, to make it more scientific. But what I've seen in Indigenous ceremony is almost like the opposite. Um, this is what what we call Iwayazanazoyeya, the American Psychiatric Association would call that a culture-bound syndrome, or they would have in the DSM-4 days. And may have dismissed it because it speaks to a lot of things that are considered to be different diagnoses in psychiatry. However, in this place, Iwayazanazoyeya blankets a lot of different kinds of experience, where centeredness is the goal. We're seeing human beings as being uncentered. And this is a very different way of thinking about suffering and healing than what you usually encounter in Western society and in biomedicine. We tend to use a metaphor of improvement, of healing, of atonement. Sometimes my interlocutors at this site will make comparisons to Christian notions of atonement in the way that healing is understood within biomedicine. Sometimes we can even romanticize struggle, and we can think about healing as a matter of a fight where you are trying to overcome odds, and we can be a little romantic about this. But what I experienced when I was there, what I observed, is that there's a goal of removing conflict. Sometimes to the point where they say that people have unrealistic expectations of what it means to heal. You're not supposed to feel good all of the time. It's unrealistic. We're not supposed to be in a state of awe of nature or of whatever it is. What we need to be is balanced. We need to be okay. We need to heal the discord within ourselves, and purge these kinds of violence and suffering that are unnatural. Iwayazanazoyeya. There's a spatial dimension to this in the way that the indigenous people that I worked with talk about it. And this comes directly from the experience of colonization and removals, and also being deployed in the military in war. And Iwayazanazoyeya in this place originally was being thought of as something that was compounded by the severance of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands and culture. And this has also included things like having toxic forms of masculinity projected by European society. And a very important part of the healing process there is working everyone through recognizing the social constructedness of those experiences. This was something that early on was thought of as, and being understood for good reason, in how it had impacted Native American men, particularly Vietnam War veterans in that generation. But through time, it was sort of an accidental discovery, but one that doesn't surprise the elders now when they look at it. This specific approach is healing for a lot of different people, including white men like myself. Here at the end of this lecture, I want to share a conversation I had with another elder there when I first started working in the place. And he told me, when I was asking him about the work that's done in those ceremonies, he said, what your project is really about on a fundamental level is the kind of violent, toxic masculinity that was cultivated in European culture, and the wreckage of this that has been sown not only into colonized peoples, but also into the bodies and souls of Europeans, notably European men. And he said the soldier and their trauma are something that we're allowed to talk about in our society, but that we've been forced to do so in inadequate terms. And that it's necessary in this healing space to recognize the unique trauma of indigenous people and acknowledging that generational trauma exists. And he told me that our understanding is inadequate as a society, but that the process of the ceremonies provide you with a worldview that allows you to reflect on things like your service and your place in society, regardless of your cultural background or who you are as a human being. There is explicit connection to other living things in the world. And in a lot of ways, the experience of the ceremonies themselves are this experience is an experience of being grounded, of the acknowledgement of one's place in society, but in a way that is mutual and allowing everyone to recognize their connectedness to other human beings. This is an explicitly social approach to understanding a condition, which can be missed in a medicalized world where we struggle in medicine to recognize the deep significance of social experience. And I'm going to apply this as well, even to the way that some people nowadays are trying to approach moral injury. There are a number of clinicians who have taken interest in the concept of moral injury, which is a good thing. I'm glad that we are, as a society, trying to think outside of the box of post-traumatic stress disorder. But what you will see, I'm not going to mention names, but if you see how some people, particularly in the medical field, are trying to understand and process the concept of moral injury, unlike the way that, for example, Jonathan Shea conceived of moral injury at the very beginning, the concept of right and wrong is framed as something psychological and something internal, something that comes from one's belief in wrongdoing. And in that clinical model, this clinical attempt to use biomedicine to explain moral injury, we see people trying to understand this form of suffering as being a consequence of the way that someone understands the world and what someone has been led to believe is right and wrong, which is a very individual thing and is an individual, is consequential in a society that individualizes people so much. However, in the treatment of Iwa Yazan Azuyeya, this indigenous term, which I think shares much more in common with moral injury than PTSD, the healing process is necessarily social. It's a necessarily social thing through which people learn to recognize not only the ways that we have been traumatized, not only the ways that we have experienced pain and suffered, the way that we experience something like moral injury is not just a medical phenomena, but this is a thing that we as a people, as a human entity, are experiencing together. They wouldn't use the word sin for sure, but our wrongdoings, the wrongdoings that we encounter in the world as we move through it, that injure us in this way, these are shared experiences, and the healing has to be shared. And it is a process of understanding not just what we've been through, but also understanding the way that our medicalized frames of understanding our bodies and our minds and our souls are inadequate. Because in a lot of ways, those very schemas for approaching healing are born of a lot of the same processes that created the conditions for our suffering, the scenarios that create moral injury. And I'm not saying that medicine is bad. When I'm sick or injured, I generally go to the doctor and ask for help, and I trust them to help me most of the time. But to talk about something like indigenous ritual, indigeneity is a condition that exists because of colonization. We can't go into a practice of a particular people or a particular tribe, look at it, and then say, here's how indigenous people do things. Let's learn their methods. If we're going to look at indigenous ritual and try to learn from it, what we need to understand is that the reason that the concept of indigenous people even being a thing in our world is because of colonialism. And necessarily, an indigenous practice towards healing is inevitably a decolonial practice. And even if we try as we can in our society to try to romanticize things like that, often in ways that Indigenous people can find very offensive and patronizing. Um, the truth is that Indigenous experience in the world today is a very overt experience with colonialism, which can provide some very deep insights into the kinds of things that many people like myself have experienced when we've encountered moral injury. So it's not just a physical thing. It's not just breaking down the mind and the body or even the soul and seeing how these injuries occur and how to heal them, but it's a manner. It is a process of healing through orienting ourselves to a greater social society. And in a world that alienates us, in a world that creates individuals, that individualizes people so much, that deep individualization and severance and alienation from the social world can itself be injurious morally. So, in conclusion, in opposition to medicalized schemas, the rituals that I participated in collapse the distinction between social and biological experience. I'm also going to say between social and personal experience or individual experience. For Indigenous peoples in the world today, the impact of colonialism on society is such that the suffering addressed in ceremonies is inherent. It's inherent to everyone. Being a member of this society means iwayazan azuyeya, or moral injury. The elders there assert that this impacts everyone in colonial society, including people primarily of European ancestry. Healing requires the overt acknowledgement of colonial trauma, and healing practices include a culture of radical inclusivity and perpetual orientation to one's connection to all things. And that last point is the most important. Breaking down this atomization and individualization and orienting a person to their connection to the world, to the people around them, to the people who are going through this life together, or as they would say there, our experience as spirits having a human experience, is where healing from this kind of suffering comes from. So thank you very much for hearing me out here. Take care.